Disney's Cruella, a novelization. Chapter 5. Estella was having the best dream. She stood at the end of a long runway, watching as models wearing her creations sauntered along to incredible bursts of applause. Beside her stood her mum, her face shining with pride. Her mother smiled, turning to her. "I'm so proud of you, Estella," she said. "You've made a name for yourself, even without me." Estella blinked awake, the last wisps of her dream disappearing. Sitting up, she saw that morning had come. Men in suits walked quickly by the fountain, immune to its beauty. Women, dressed up for the day, despite the early hour, walked more leisurely as behind them their nannies pushed their prams. Suddenly, Estella spotted a boy, around her age, though even worse for wear, crossing to the fountain. A small, one-eyed chihuahua trotted at his heels. The boy's head swiveled left and right, and then he pulled out a makeshift fishing rod and began to pull coins out of the fountain with it. Then he dropped them, one by one, into a large sack. "What is he doing?" Estella thought. She watched as the boy continued to fish for a few more minutes. No one else seemed to notice, and Estella wondered if this was perhaps normal in London. Her eyes drifted from the fountain as she spotted another boy, as dirty and downtrodden as the other, and about the same age as well. With what appeared to be practiced ease, the boy was repeatedly bumping into passers-by and, under Estella's close gaze, picking their pockets and slipping the stolen wallets or money into his own tattered pants. Estella continued to watch him, transfixed by the casualness and grace with which the boy was executing this petty thievery. Suddenly, sensing someone's eyes on him, the boy looked at Estella. She gasped and quickly closed her eyes, pretending to be asleep. The ruse didn't work. "Morning," said a voice, presumably belonging to the pickpocket. Estella kept her eyes closed. "So what's she?" another voice asked. This one's accent was harsher, his tone less friendly and more reserved. Estella almost opened her eyes to snap that she wasn't a what, but thought better of it. Apparently the boy hadn't been asking what she was, but rather what she was doing. "Watching us," the first boy answered, "but pretending to be asleep." "Undercover copper?" the second boy guessed. "Nah, too scared looking to be a cop," the other boy said. "I'm not scared," Estella said, keeping her eyes closed, even though her cover was surely blown. She was beginning to feel slightly foolish, but if she didn't open her eyes, she hoped maybe they would go away. No such luck. "Also looks like 12 years old," the kinder voice observed. "So, possibly too young." Estella had had enough. Snapping open her eyes, she jumped to her feet. To her delight, she startled both boys, who scurried back a few steps. "Stay back!" she commanded, emboldened by their reaction. At her feet, Buddy growled low. The bigger boy, the one who had been fishing, rolled his eyes. "I'll just take her out." He was the one with the meaner voice. He stepped forward, but before he could even lift a hand, Estella drew back her legs and kicked him in the gut. He doubled over, cradling his stomach. "Ow!" he wheezed. Turning, she looked at the other boy. He was slighter in build, and his rosy cheeks gave him a deceptively innocent appearance, but his eyes were tough and streetwise. She stood across from him, fists raised. She wasn't going to let him take her down either. "Look, love," the boy said, keeping his voice calm and level, like he was trying to calm a wild animal. "The cops come by every day at 8 a.m., like clockwork." He paused, as if unsure of his next words. Then in a rush he said, "You should come with us." His friends looked up and shot the slighter boy a glare, shaking his head vehemently. "No way," he said. "Just go back to your family, little girl." It was hard to hear him over his wheezing as his face turned a lovely shade of puce. "She has no family," the thinner, taller boy said when Estella didn't respond. Her head snapped over to look at him. How did he know? She had barely exchanged a word with him. "I recognize the look," the boy said, answering her unspoken question. Tears welled up in Estella's eyes, and she angrily brushed them away. He didn't know a thing. Still, He was offering her a way to not be alone. It was tempting. Sort of. But before she could speak, Buddy let out a happy little yip. Glancing down, Estella saw that he and the Chihuahua had begun to play. She groaned. Turning back, she looked at the boy. "I don't even know you," she said softly. For the first time since they had met, the boy smiled, revealing uneven teeth and a small dimple that Estella might have found charming in a different setting. "I'm Jasper. Pleased to meet you," he said warmly. He pointed at his friend, who still couldn't stand up straight. "That's Horace. Say hello, Horace." The other boy shook his head. "I'm not saying hello." Jasper opened his mouth to say something, but stopped. Estella followed his gaze across the park to where a cop had appeared. Jasper pulled out a pocket watch. 5 to 8. That's not fair. He pocketed the watch. "We all need to run. Now!" Estella hesitated only long enough to watch as the cop took out his whistle and blew. She didn't need any more encouragement. Turning, she followed Jasper and Horace as they raced out of the park and onto the streets, with Buddy and the Chihuahua at their heels. It looked like Estella had just made some new friends. Jasper ran, every so often checking to be sure the girl was following. He was sure that she had never run that fast or for that long in her life, but to her credit, she kept up. They raced along side streets and over scattered crates, through back gardens of flats. They twisted and turned, making their way out of the ritzy area of London and into its seedier neighborhoods. The cops stayed apace for most of the chase. Finally, Jasper ducked through a hole in a fence and into the courtyard of an abandoned factory. He kept running toward a hole in the brick siding. Jasper turned. Seeing the girl's hesitation, he gestured for her to follow. She didn't move, her eyes wild, reflecting her inner turmoil. He knew what she was thinking. He had been there before. She was at a turning point. If she moved forward, her world would be forever changed. But if she stayed, the cop was sure to find her. And then what would her life be? The dog whined at her feet. The noise spurred her forward. It wasn't much of a choice, but it was the only choice she had. Jasper led them into the brick building and up a flight of stairs to the second story. The interior staircase was all that was left. The rest of the floor was gone. They kept going, through an open doorway, along a roof, and then Jasper and Horace jumped, disappearing through a coal chute into a ceiling. Behind them, the girl took a deep breath and did the same. Jasper landed with a thud on a pile of mattresses and got to his feet. Beside him, Horace was mumbling something to himself about a secret hideout and not showing her. But it was too late. She had already seen it. "Where are we?" the girl asked, standing up. Her clothes were covered in a fine layer of black soot. "Home sweet home," Jasper answered. The girl gazed around the space, her expression skeptical. Jasper's own gaze followed as he tried to see the space through her eyes. There were a few more mattresses on the floor and what must have once been a rug, but now looked more like a rag. A chair with only 3 working legs wobbled precariously in a corner, and the only light came through a large stained glass window at the end of the room. Home? Maybe. Sweet? That was questionable. Ignoring her skeptical look, Jasper took a seat on one of the cleaner mattresses. "So, what's your story?" he asked. She was in their lair. They might as well become friendly. Horace, however, did not seem obliged by social custom. "Where are your parents?" he asked sharply. Immediately the girl's eyes welled with tears. Jasper shifted uncomfortably. He and Horace shared helpless, not knowing what to do other than wait silently as the girl's tears dried and she pulled herself together. "My mom's dead," she finally said, answering both their questions, her strong tone a contrast to her tear-streaked face. Jasper nodded. He had expected that answer. "I'm thinking," he said after a moment, "you should stay here. Be part of our gang?" He trailed off, hoping she would take the bait and tell them her name. "Estella," she answered. Jasper smiled, but Horace now wore the same pained expression as when Estella had gut-kicked him. "She should what?" he said in exasperation. He shook his head. "This has not been discussed." "We could use a girl to be a distraction. Help us look innocent," Jasper pointed out. Horace cocked his head.
She does look really sad and scrawny and pathetic and helpless.
He didn't get further as Estella walked over and punched him in the arm.
Oi! Why do you keep hitting me?
It only happens when you talk, Estella replied, earning her a grin from Jasper and another frown from Horace. She paused. You're criminals, she said, the word sounding harsher when she spoke it aloud. Jasper shrugged.
You say criminals, I say entrepreneurs.
I want to be a fashion designer, not a thief, she said softly.
That's funny, Horace said. You're a little kid.
Estella opened her mouth to protest, but Jasper interrupted.
He's right, he said. You don't get that many options, Estella. Just us.
Estella sank down on a nearby mattress. Jasper's frank words seemed to take the fight out of her. She put her head in her hands.
Is she crying again? Horace whispered loudly. Her mom died, Jasper said. You remember what that's like?
Horace was silent for a moment.
Yeah, I do,
he finally said, his tone a bit softer than before. At his words, Estella looked up. As she did, her hat tumbled from her head, revealing her hair. Horace yelped. Self-consciously, the girl brushed it back and reached for her hat. It has to go, she said, but Jasper stopped her.
I quite like it,
he said simply, earning him a small smile. Still, she was right. Hair like that was too recognizable. If she was going to become one of them, she would need to be able to blend in, hide, be unremarkable. Horace seemed to have the same thought. He stood up, walked to a box on the ground, and began to rummage around. A moment later he straightened up, a bottle in each hand.
Red or yellow?
He asked. Leaving her hat on the floor, Estella stood up and made her way to the Lairs' lone bathroom. She shut the door behind her, and for a while the only sound to be heard was that of running water. When Estella finally emerged, the black and white hair was gone. She was now a redhead. She tilted her head from side to side. Not bad, Jasper thought. So, she said, ignoring their curious looks, how's it work? Jasper smiled. Don't worry, he said. We'll start you off with the simple stuff. It was time to teach Estella how to be a thief. Jasper was true to his word, which Estella found somewhat ironic, given he was a thief. But like he promised, he started her off with the simple stuff. First, there was the basic Adam Tyler, as Jasper called it. It was a quick pickpocket move. The most difficult part was getting everyone, dogs included, to work together. While Horace bumped into a passerby, Estella would pick their pocket and drop it into Buddy's open mouth. A quick trot over to Jasper ended with sleight of hand. Before the target even turned the corner, the wallet was on the ground, empty, and the gang was headed the other way, pockets full. Simple. But the moves got harder. Fast. And Estella learned them all. Faster. She learned how to pickpocket. She learned how to be the distraction. She learned how to spot an undercover cop and how to scope a mark. She mastered the waterworks, a move that involved making a driver mistakenly think they had hit Buddy and always ended in tears, and even managed to make up a few moves of her own. To Estella's surprise, she quickly adapted to her new life. When they weren't out on the streets being entrepreneurs, Estella threw herself into making her new home feel a bit more, well, homey. She replaced the dirty mattresses with newer ones. Rummaging through the garbage cans in the fancy part of town, she found barely used art and pillows, plates, and decorations. With Jasper's help, she dragged them back to the lair, and before long, the walls were no longer bare. A few lights brightened the space, and Estella even managed to find room dividers so she could have a space of her own. The lair taken care of, Estella turned her attention to the boys. While they were pulling in decent money with their regular heists, she knew they could do more. The only problem was they were limited in where they could go. They had minimal clothing, and even fewer ways to really clean that clothing. More often than not, their clothes were stained, ripped, or patched. If they wanted to steal from the rich, they were going to need to look, well, richer, or at least look more like the people who worked for the rich. With a new goal set, Estella quickly formulated a plan. She had the talent to make them all look better. The rest would fall into place. She just needed to get her hands on one special item. A few nights later, she and the boys were standing at the back entrance of a tailor shop. They shifted uncomfortably on their feet. The street was too quiet. They were too obvious. This wasn't their typical mark, and they didn't like it. But as Estella had pointed out earlier, they needed to get inside and get what Estella was after. "We could be bigger, better, richer," she had told them. "You just have to trust me. I know what I'm doing." She had gotten Horace at richer. Jasper was still uncertain, but she did know what she was doing. Standing on her tiptoes, she propped open a little window above the door. Horace squeezed their chihuahua, Wink, through the window, and they heard him land lightly on the other side. A moment later, there was a scrabbling at the back door, and it swung open. Tiptoeing inside while the boys kept watch, Estella made her way over to the tailor's workbench. There, gleaming even in the dim light, was a brand new sewing machine. Estella's heart filled at the sight of it. She hefted it into her arms, taking a deep, satisfied breath. Then turning, she fled the shop. The boys followed close behind. From that moment on, it was Estella who came up with their jobs. She sewed altar boy costumes for Sundays so Horace and Jasper could collect for the needy. She created butler uniforms and sent them out to serve the rich and famous and help themselves to their pockets. She whipped up costume after costume with stolen fabric and a wild imagination, while the boys watched in awe. Estella was happy. She didn't realize it at first, but while she still thought of her mother every time she opened her eyes or walked by a fountain or saw a flash of bright fabric, the pain had become just a dull ache. She had a new life now. While it wasn't one she could ever have imagined when she lived in her cottage, it wasn't all that bad. She could sew, she had friends, she had a roof over her head, even if it leaked. Yes, she was happy, and in this state of general contentment, the years passed by.